be a part of it. The title of my presentation is The Role of Social Capital and Civil Society in Public Policy, Social Change and Welfare. The objective of the paper, so mainstream economics reduces concepts of social capital and civil society to means of profit and competition, reproducing inequality and power. But there are alternative approaches that identify social capital and civil society with state synergy relations, with generalized norms and networks of reciprocity, cooperation, and trust. And these elements enable civil society organizations to promote solidarity, democracy, public policy, social change, and welfare. Now, similarly, post-Keynesian institutionalism recognizes the narrow conception of Homo economicus on the one hand, and the creative role of the state, democratic institutions, and civic values on the other hand. However, questions remain. How do social groups organize and mobilize collectively to voice social needs and concerns? How do they make state officials accountable and responsive to social demands? How do they challenge and resist powerful groups which pursue particularized interests via clientelistic relations with state officials and policymakers? So with this paper, we attempt to fill that void by connecting studies on social capital and civil society with the literature on the commons and participatory and deliberative democracy. So the structure of the paper is simply to begin with certain definitions of social capital and civil society and their relationship with the state and public policy. And then we try to connect this literature with processes of commoning and democratic participation and deliberation to find ways to galvanize the civil society to pursue social values. And we conclude with some remarks. Now, since the late 20th century, we have witnessed a resurgence of academic and political interest in the social capital, in concepts of social capital and civil society. Social capital is usually identified with social norms and networks of reciprocity, trust, and cooperation. Civil society consists of non-governmental and not-for-profit self-governing organizations and groups. The idea is that elements of social capital are considered crucial for civil society precisely because social norms and networks of trust and cooperation enhance civil society's ability to cultivate values of solidarity, democracy, public policy, and social welfare. Now, national governments and international organizations have tried to put these concepts into practice by introducing them in their development policies and programs. Actually, applicants have to demonstrate, applicants for funds from these programs have to demonstrate that several social groups, public and private, social organizations are involved in achieving the program's economic and political objectives, and that they are involved throughout the process of the planning, the implementation, and the evaluation of the program. However, under the influence of third-way politics and the post-Washington consensus, social capital and civil society were reduced to means for serving market objectives of profit and competition, to reproduce social inequalities in power structures. So in a way, there was a dark side of social capital, the influence of powerful economic and political interests that was ignored. However, there are studies on social capital and civil society that aim to unravel those conditions under which individuals and groups can build the norms and networks that enable them to establish cooperation and solidarity, to mobilize social forces that scrutinize and challenge the social injustices and inequalities in society. But what are these conditions? So the first step to establish the conditions under which this could be achieved is to provide alternative conceptions of social capital and civil society that break with the underlying individualist and consequentialist assumptions of Homo economicus. So we see social capital as a set of social norms and networks that are pursued for their intrinsic value. Social norms and networks of cooperation and trust derive from social, political, moral motivations and processes, and create common identities that express people's commitment to shared values and their responsibility toward others. Also, we see civil society as a possibility of building a counter-hegemony, emanating from collective efforts of the working class, intellectuals, and social organizations with the aim to transform economies and societies. The second step is to examine what kind of social capital and civil society can transform economies and societies toward the goals of equality and justice. Now, according to the social capital and civil society literature, we need to build synergistic relations and generalized norms and networks of cooperation. This means we need to build relations that consist of synergies across diverse groups and with the state, so as to combine what is called embeddedness and autonomy, to combine bonding social capital with bridging social capital, bonding social capital, which emphasizes intragroup ties, and bridging social capital, which emphasizes intergroup ties. So the idea of combining embeddedness and autonomy is first at the micro level to enable members of various groups to explore the opportunities, practices, and visions of collective action, participation, and welfare of other groups in society. Whereas at the macro level, this combination allows us to overcome the exploitation and domination of powerful groups and the impact that clientelistic networks with the state have at the expense of broader social welfare objectives. Now, this is particularly crucial in the context of authoritarian governance structures and sectarian societies, so as to find ways to mobilize social forces within civil society and to sustain the struggle to inform and reform public policy. Of course, the literature on social capital and civil society is rather silent on what ways we can employ to build these synergistic relations and generalized norms and networks of cooperation. So the third step to discover how social capital and civil society can develop this potential was to connect this literature with the literature on the commons and participatory and deliberative democracy. So with regard to democracy, a mainstream economic focus is mostly on competitive democracy, but we also want to talk about a democratic process that is participatory and deliberative. When we say participatory, we imply the direct involvement of all those affected. And when we say deliberative, we highlight rational discussion and deliberation in the public space. This means that the voter is not like the mainstream economics median voter who has preferences, exogenously determined, approaches the ballot box, casts her vote, and that's the end of the democratic process. We refer to a kind of democratic process where we are open to share our views, to discuss with others, and in that way, we are also open to changing our own views if we see that social justice, values of social justice and welfare are better served in alternative ways. Now, post-Keynesian institutionalism emphasizes some of these processes and talks about mediating structures beyond the market and the state that take active role in economic planning and promote values and institutions of participatory and democratic decision-making. In this paper, we seek for a more active role for civil society, an active role for creating the social values and prefigurative relations that promote a truly participatory and deliberative democratic process and transform economies and societies. To do this, we turn to the literature on the commons. And we don't see the commons solely as the management of common pool resources, as much as a process of commoning, a process of social interaction, struggle, and transformation, where alternative values of production and reproduction are introduced based on collective labor, equal access to resources, and egalitarian forms of decision-making. Some people might think, well, it's very difficult to move beyond conventional institutions of civil society and public policy. Well, actually, according to some authors like Gibson and Graham, these collective values and institutions already exist, and they take the form of a diverse economy of alternative, non-capitalist subjectivities, rationalities, and imaginaries, founded on values and practices of participatory and deliberative democracy. In the paper, I refer to an example by Gibson and Graham of hybrid research collectives, where researchers actually discuss with members of the community all those affected by a certain social problem, so that the researcher is not there only to document certain events and certain views, but also to contribute actively in the solution of the problem. Now, to conclude, our discussion focused on how social capital and civil society can impact public policy by trying to shed further light on the dynamics of state-society interactions and enrich other traditions involved in this kind of discussion. We observe that certain kinds of social capital founded on state-society synergy and generalized cooperation can enable civil society organizations to promote social values of democracy and solidarity. We suggested that civil society and social capital can develop this potential by employing the values and institutions of the commons and democratic participation and deliberation. And I think this is very crucial in our times, where the civic space has been severely restricted by violations of freedoms and human rights, and by violations of social and environmental protection. Of course, in this kind of context, we see inequality and injustice increasing, but fortunately we see, and we can see the emergence of social groups and movements that can counteract these trends and protect social values for all. So just a final point to acknowledge that this article draws on ideas from a chapter I submitted to a book edited by Charles Whalen. It will come out, and it is entitled A Modern Guide to Post-Keynesian Institutional Economics. So thank you for your attention. I hope I was on time.
You are absolutely perfect. 13 right now.
Thank you very much.
One of the things I want to do is give the presenters a chance to start thinking about the questions. For almost all the presenters, I'm going to ask the exact same question. How do you achieve what you're looking for? And I'll give some ideas about that in a minute. We have next, if I remember right, Kosta Josifidis and Novica Supic. You ready to go?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. First motivation for our paper. Our paper is motivated by the observation that health expenditure in the United States is the highest in the world, but at the same time, the United States lags behind in many health outcomes compared to the other developed countries. In this context, the aim of this paper is to question from institutionalist perspective public support to the pharmaceutical industry, which is linked with the growing control of corporate capital over public health in the United States. The structure of our presentation follow our papers, as we can see in this slide. Introduction, overview of the US healthcare system, then we will focus on pharmaceutical industry, and finally conclusion. The US healthcare system stands in sharp contrast to the original institutional economics. From the perspective of institutionalist, healthcare is not a consumer good, but a public good for workers and society. Therefore, it's not surprising that institutionalist economists were among the first who advocate for the reform of national healthcare system and for establishing universal healthcare. Thus, John Commons had played a leading role in creating the US Social Security program in the 1930s and the 1940s. He argued that the cost of industrial progress should not be borne exclusively by workers. Since workers could not control the workplace, health insurance must be joint responsibility of workers, employers, and the state. Some similar ideas can be found in works of other institutionalists, notably John Morris Clark. Namely, Clark recognized that workers' health and working capacity have to be maintained like capital in order to remain useful. Otherwise, the community will suffer a loss through the deterioration of its working power. More recently, many heterodox economists question the applicability of core institutional preposition to healthcare issue. Drawback of healthcare system based on neoliberal principles become particularly noticeable during the COVID-19 pandemic. And institutional economics provides not only deeper insight into the problems of the American healthcare system, but also indicates how to restore it. There is widespread agreement that the current US healthcare system is inefficient, overpriced, inadequate, and needs a major change. The main problem lies in the fact that US healthcare system is developed on the neoliberal view on public health, according to which healthcare is an individual rather than public responsibility. In this framework, healthcare is treated as a consumer good, while institutions and policies that address health issues are designed around the concept of consumer sovereignty and the rational decision of Homo economicus. Therefore, it's not surprising that private health insurance in the United States is far more prevalent than public one. For example, in 2020, 2/3 of Americans are covered by private health insurance plans, mostly provided by employers to their workers. There is also possibility to buy private health insurance directly as an individual from insurance company. This is the less common type of health insurance, covering just 10% of population. The public health insurance account for about 1/3 of population. However, it doesn't mean that the whole population is covered by health insurance. Unlike the other developed countries, the United States doesn't have universal healthcare coverage. Consequently, almost 9% of population, or 28 millions of Americans, don't have health insurance. Heavily reliance on employment-based insurance make the US health system vulnerable to economic cycles. The data collected at the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic indicates a sudden increase in employment has caused many American families to lose their health insurance. Thus, between 2019 and 2020, the number of people covered by employment-based insurance declined by about 6 million. This increase was only partly offset by an increase in number of people covered by public health insurance programs, leaving an additional 2 million of people uninsured. The impact of pandemic is also manifested in the increase in the number of workers who are underinsured. These people keep their jobs, but their health insurance doesn't cover full healthcare service. The uninsured and underinsured Americans receive less medical care. In addition, these groups are faced with higher costs for the same care than those with health insurance. Given that they are self-paid patients, their bills are higher than what most patients with insurance actually pay. Constrained by low income and faced with higher prices, the uninsured and underinsured are able to cover only a small fraction of their healthcare bills. The rest is so-called uncompensated care cost. Uncompensated care costs have a significant distributional effects on the US healthcare system. These costs are passed by hospital to patients in the form of higher prices for medical services, or these costs are passed by government to the insured in the form of higher taxes needed to fund healthcare system. Most of the funds that serve to offset uncompensated care costs come from the federal government. The implication is that uncompensated care payments are actually implicit insurance of the uninsured and represent a classic example of cost sharing and shifting. Given the higher cost of medical care for the uninsured and distributive effects of uncompensated care payments, the US healthcare system is likely less efficient and certainly less equitable than universal healthcare coverage. Empirical data support the notion that the US healthcare system might be more efficient. Health insurance is heavily subsidized by the federal government. For example, in 2021, Medicare and Medicaid were the largest spending items in the federal budget, 1.7 times more than military budget. The federal government also subsidized employment-based health insurance by tax exclusion, which is the single largest federal tax expenditure item. As a result, health expenditure as a percent of GDP in the United States is the highest in the world. However, despite expenditure devoted to healthcare, the United States lags behind in many health outcomes compared to the other developed countries. Thus, the United States is ranked worse than the OECD average in life expectancy, obesity rate, and avoidable mortality. Huge public expenditure and relatively poor results don't mean that every actor in the health system is a loser. The US institutional environment provides unique advantages for the pharmaceutical industry. The United States has the largest pharmaceutical market in the world, while health expenditure per capita is the highest spending per capita in the world. Accordingly, it's not surprising that the US pharmaceutical industry is the largest in the world by production and revenue generation. The economic records of pharmaceutical industry are better than that of other industries in the United States. As we can see from this table, the largest US pharmaceutical companies are ranked at the very top in terms of market capitalization, revenues, net income, and dividends. In addition, there is a strong trend towards concentration in the industry. Data from this table show that the value of acquisitions made in pharmaceutical industry is ranked as the second largest in the US economy. Many acquisitions in pharmaceutical industry are speculative in nature, given that it's usually cheaper for big capital to buy a small innovative company and thus be engaged in production and commercialization new products than to make risk investment in research and development. The high profitability of pharmaceutical industry doesn't mean high net income retained in the business. The data on dynamics of cash dividends and income in this figure suggests that US pharmaceutical companies are financialized entities with the main purpose of maximizing shareholder value, even at the expense of company net income. Despite the fact that the US pharmaceutical industry is highly concentrated and profitable, the US government heavily supports the pharmaceutical business. This support is manifested above all in government subsidies and programs that increase demand for new pharmaceuticals. For example, in 2019, the federal and state expenditure on prescription drugs make up more than 40% of the total prescription drug expenditures in the United States. At first glance, the fact that federal government is the largest buyer of pharmaceutical products is not problematic by itself, given the key role that government plays in healthcare system in every country. What's problematic is the way in which prices of drugs are determined. Unlike most developed countries, American drug prices are largely unregulated prices and set by producers. As a result, overall drug prices in the United States are higher compared with other OECD countries. Based on neoclassical theory of competitive market, the pharmaceutical industry makes the argument that drug prices should be determined by the market, not by the government. In this vein, high prices are justified by the high cost and risk associated with research and development of new drugs, which is widely accepted by the US legislators. These neoclassical arguments are strongly disputed from the institutionalist perspective. The critique of free market model arises from the observation that healthcare is not a market commodity that can be analyzed in simply demand and supply framework. Unlike most commodities, demand for pharmaceutical products usually is not matter of free will and choice of patients. The demand for pharmaceutical products is derived demand in the sense that this demand is determined by physicians and pharmacists rather than by the people in need of medical treatment. Moreover, pharmaceutical companies spend a huge amount of money on drug advertisement, which affects not only the choice of patients for non-prescription drugs, but also prescription patterns of physicians. Similar to the demand for pharmaceutical products, market forces do not play an exclusive role in determining the supply of pharmaceutical products. The pharmaceutical industry heavily relies on the findings from basic research in biomedical sciences, which is mostly funded by federal government. National Institutes of Health is the largest single funder of biomedical research in the world. Much of its funding supported basic research that can be crucial for development of new drugs. Although National Institutes of Health is designed with primary aim of improving health of Americans, the biggest beneficiary is corporate capital, which is, thanks to such federal support, able to reduce cost and risk associated with biomedical research. In addition to funding, pharmaceutical industry is supported by a set of laws and institutions designed to facilitate development and commercialization of new drugs. Certainly, the most important piece of legislation on this issue is Bayh-Dole Act. The act was initially passed to enable small businesses access to new federally funded technologies developed in universities. Later, the act expanded beyond universities and small business, including all research organizations and large companies. In practice, this means that discoveries done with public funds can be transferred to the corporate capital. A pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, an association that represents the interests of the US pharmaceutical industry, persuaded US legislator to extend patent protection and to get market exclusivity for certain types of drugs. Accordingly, pharmaceutical patents might be seen less as tool to stimulate innovation and more as tool to provide monopoly control over a great number of publicly supported and funded medical research. This created a new business model in pharmaceutical industry in which risk associated with innovation has been socialized, but the gains have been privatized and largely concentrated in the hands of a corporate capital. And finally, conclusion, very briefly, in our paper, we try to summarize facts and arguments that support the institutionalist critique of the US healthcare system in general and the pharmaceutical industry in particular. Despite the highest health expenditure in the world, the United States lag behind in many health outcomes compared to the most other leading nations. The main problems lie in the fact that US healthcare system is based on the neoliberal view on public health, according to which healthcare is individual rather than public responsibility, supported by institutional environment and liberal rules that provides unique advantages for the pharmaceutical industry. The US pharmaceutical industry is highly financialized and dominated by big corporate capital, which enjoys super profits primarily through patent protection, market exclusivity, unregulated prices, and public funded, rather than through commodity production, research and development, competition, and free market principles. In the context of original institutional economics, the current US healthcare system may be seen as a reflection of the vested interest of corporate capital in the pharmaceutical industry at the expense of common man. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Excellent paper. We have next on the agenda, Eric Glock. Have you showed up? Are you in here?
I'm here, yeah.
Okay, are you ready to go?
I am.
All right, excellent. Please feel free. Share your screen if you can. I'm not sure if you're...
Okay. It's kind of not letting me. It says the host disabled participant screen sharing.
It's
Sorry,
particularly,
this is AV Tech. You should be able to.
he came in late.
Yeah, maybe they
Yeah.
can read it. It got,
Eric Hake. Is it Hake?
no, it's a Glock, Glock.
Oh, okay. One moment here. I've got multiple Erics. Let me find you here.
Dang you with the Eric name.
Yeah.
Too many Erics in this world.
And,
All
and
right.
you,
You should be
and you-
good now.
All right.
And you got one Erica, right?
Yeah, that as well.
Thanks, Eric. All right,
Okay,
over to you. If you see
Okay,
my
are we
picture
seeing
come up,
my,
you're
screen
getting it
here?
13 minutes.
okay. So, there we go. Okay. So during this presentation, there's a lot of kind of text slides. I'm not going to say too much during them, kind of let you guys read it, guys and gals. And if I get to kind of a chart or something that needs explanation, I'll say more. But yeah, this sort of approach is kind of an amalgam of different theories brought together, all trying to attain a goal, which I'm going to lay out shortly. Okay, this is just a little note on supply shocks in economics. So let's let you read. Okay, that was enough time. So these are the fundamental questions I'm addressing today. And it's what are the necessary conditions of social welfare maximization and how do we meet them? So start with the two necessary conditions, and those are universal subsistence and zero non-renewable resource use. So let's start with a quote from Jevons here. The quote is about the infinite utility of subsistence goods is actually echoed by Frank Ramsey in 1928 and Kenneth in 1999 as well. And the reason I'm including this issue is because if the utility of food is infinite and the baseline utility, i.e. if we're consuming nothing, our utility is zero, and consuming a good with infinite utility doesn't leave much room for any more utility of consumption. What actually makes more sense and is consistent with observation is that zero subsistence actually equals an infinite disutility. And Jevons was aware of the value of the importance of disutility, which has been forgotten in economics today. I think one of what I consider the three major failings of macroeconomic theory is that it simply assumes that people don't really need to live, or they don't need subsistence. And the way it handles that is by basically having a baseline of zero non-subsistence. So what I'm proposing is that at non-subsistence, we're actually at an infinite level of disutility. Furthermore, I'm going to go ahead and make an assumption that the ordinal value of subsisting below a safe, secure, healthy, and safe level is ordinally infinite, i.e., no amount of agents who are consuming above a comfortable level of subsistence can ever compensate for agents who are below that level. Even if we took the in a society subsistence above subsistence, it still compensates for even one agent who is subsisting below it. And as a result of that, what we get is that welfare society can never be maximized unless every agent is subsisting. If there's one agent not subsisting and the rest of the agents are subsisting at very high levels of consumption, it will never be a welfare maximizing society. There has to be universal subsistence in order for societies to be maximizing their wealth. I'm also referencing what I call the Ursula K. Le Guin wrote a book, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. And in this book, she suggested a society that was a utopia other than the fact that it was driven by one child's suffering. So according to this analysis, that would be an inefficient society. It's kind of bringing an ethical dimension to what's otherwise a kind of an efficiency analysis, positivistic analysis. The second necessary condition is zero non-renewable resource use. So let you read this quote by Kip Viscusi. Okay, So I hope that's clear enough. The counter to that argument, however, is that the alternative cost of not using an infinite an infinitely valuable natural resource is that we may end up foregoing what's infinitely valuable. If there were to be a technology that came out of using a non-renewable resource that kind of lasted forever, or if there was houses that were infinitely replaced, that kind of makes sense too. Basically, if we weren't operating with that infinite utility, then any human development from the dawn of humanity would have been inefficient. So in fact, what I'm proposing is going on is that using non-renewable resources basically has a marginal cost, as there's less and less available, fewer and fewer non-renewable natural resources available, and more human-made resources, that there's actually an equilibrium. And the fact that we have an environmental crisis is indicative of the fact that we are actually at a position where essentially assuming continuing to consume non-renewable resources is happening at a net efficiency loss. Okay, so given that, we have the two necessary conditions of welfare maximization, which are universal subsistence on the one hand and non-renewable resource use on the other. And I'll just let you read this briefly. Okay, so then what is the sufficient condition of welfare maximization? And I haven't done a lot of research into happiness research by psychologists, so I'm suggesting that more be done. But I'll just let this kind of speaks for itself. So I think it's clear what I'm suggesting is that if everyone's subsisting at a decent level, further material consistency consumption is not going to lead to very much continued happiness. However, exercising the behaviors that psychologists suggest that make people happy, which are essentially low consumption, low material consumption, are how we're really going to make society happy, not with this sort of endless material consumption and the pursuit of it. So my whole approach really derives from A Safe and Just Place for Humanity by Kate Raworth. She is not a neoclassical or microeconomist, so I'm approaching this from a somewhat different way, but it's definitely sourced by her original, donut economics, in which she's suggesting that we exist in this donut here, such that we're not continuing to harm the environment, but we're also assuring that everybody has basic needs met. Obviously, mine is a sort of more simplified approach to it. And I also prefer the lettuce wrap analogies. As I'm going to talk about next, basically donuts are what I would call a Hayden bad. So this is a coin that I turned in honor of Dr. Hayden. He was speaking at University of Missouri, Kansas City, where I'm a student. And he made the comment that it's not about growth or degrowth. It's about growing goods and degrowthing bads. And the reason I'm calling his interpretation of goods and bads Hayden goods and bads is because, of course, a good and a bad in economics, i.e. neoclassical economics, is going to be called good or bad based simply on whether there's revealed preferences for it or revealed preferences for its avoidance. However, what Hayden is suggesting is that goods are what's actually good for us and bads are what's actually bad for us. So that while there may be a revealed preference for fast food, there may be a revealed preference for SUVs, there may be a real preference for sex trafficking, those aren't in fact goods, okay? And they're often bads. So there's a disjoint between what's actually good and what's actually bad. And of course, that sounds like irrationality right away, but I'm calling it misperception instead. The reason being that these revealed preferences for bads are a function of institutions. So it's actually, to consume them is actually a rational response to irrational institutions. So basically, when I have this here, the utility of consumption, sub P, that means the perceived utility of consumption, which is different from the actual utility of consumption. And when those two things are in harmony, that means that institutions are efficient, i.e. our perceptions of institutions are being our perceptions of consumption are being shaped by institutions such that what we want to perceive and what we want to consume are actually harmonious. However, when ceremonial, efficient institutions, a disjoint between what's good for us and what we think is good for us. And that's kind of, very light mathematical treatment given here. The utility of perceived consumption is a function of institutions. And if institutions are not maximally efficient, there's going to be a disjoint between the utility of perceived consumption and the utility of actual consumption. And in that case, then obviously there's a massive sort of efficiency loss. And as far as global climate change and environmental goods, there's a beautiful example in sort of classic example of ceremonial behavior of continuous consumption. Let's notice at the bottom here. You'll probably recall that Bellwood made a specific example out of women's clothing as conspicuous consumption. And it turns out that habit of consuming them simply for appearances rather than actual utility is still practiced today, despite our environmental crisis. So in essence, if these institutions can be changed, if people can stop these irrational institutions that don't involve the actual utility of consumption, instead as a false perception, then it will allow us to basically to consume less, and also, while meeting basic human needs, while also harming the environment much less. Okay, I'm gonna have to skip a lot of stuff here. So also we have path dependency and derived demand is also a major cause of environmental change that could be reduced dramatically without any real cost to society. Okay, I'm just gonna let this be read. So basically, if the paths that we're dependent on to meet ultimate goals are clean instead of dirty, then there's no utility loss, yet a major welfare gain from preserving environmental systems and freeing up more resources to get people out of poverty. Okay, so I'm gonna have to skip a lot of stuff here. Okay, so basically, how to pay for the Green New Deal. With modern monetary theory, I'll do this briefly. With any time that we use inflation as a constraint on aggregate demand, as long as we're consuming non-renewable resources, then a congressional budget constraint is superior to an inflation constraint for the environment. It's pretty easy to understand why. If we're using excess capacity, we're using excess resources, we're using excess natural resources. If those are non-renewable, then we're harming the environment at a greater rate than simply substituting the government programs with substituting private goods with government programs. If we have a congressional budget constraint, we're not consuming in the private sector, and we're simply passing that consumption onto government goods at no net loss to the environment, other than the actual specifics of the program. And that's why How to Pay for the Green New Deal by Nersisyan and Wray is largely a congressional budget constraint in which resources are used more efficiently. There is a sort of comment about inflation, and which is sort of would lead to, in my opinion, is basically exporting environmental damage. But outside of that, in that it's a congressional budget constraint, so mostly it is using resources more efficiently. That involves a more complex analysis of the economy, and we can improve this even more by stating exactly what the program is. For example, the Drawdown New Deal, I call it, the book Drawdown by Paul Hawken from 2018. He basically lists out 100 solutions. I took 54 of them, which have all of the costs and savings added up, and it turned out for a net cost of 0 over 30 years, we could draw down 630 gigatons of global greenhouse gas, whereas the best cost estimate,
left, if you could.
I'm sorry?
1 minute left,
Yep,
if you could.
Yep. Their estimate is the best cost estimate by Nersisyan and Wray is $7.6 trillion, which will bring down 172 gigatons. The orange economy is talking about, South America, in particular, the world, converting to sort of mental and artistic activities to consume those instead at much lower impact. So basically, very quickly, what I'm suggesting is that we technical view of capacity. It's all about capacity. MMT tells us that's absolutely right. And instead of proxying it with budgets or with inflation, we look at capacity. I'll just let you read this. Hidalgo has found a way to, in terms of growth, he realized that we the petty proxy. We have to understand capacity in a very complex way, and that's what I'm suggesting. Well, we understand it so that we can fit within my, so-called let it happen with everybody, and we're no longer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Once again, an interesting paper. I believe we have next up Yeva and Randy. I think Yeva is the one who's going to be doing the presentation. So if you're ready to go.
Yep. Okay. And you can see my PowerPoint?
Yep, we can
Okay.
see him fine.
Great, thank you. So this paper is based on, the presentation is based on a paper that Randy and I wrote for the Levy Economics Institute. It's a policy brief, actually. And we wrote that before the whole Build Back Better fiasco happened. That is, that it's probably not going to pass. But the logic that we use here in terms of how we approach government spending and taxation is still useful, even if the Build Back Better didn't pass or doesn't eventually pass. So when the COVID pandemic started, Congress very quickly, surprisingly, passed a huge stimulus or relief bill. I shouldn't call it stimulus, 2.2 trillion. That was the first relief bill that was in the trillions of dollars. Compared that to something like 800 billion after the global financial crisis. And they didn't stop there, which was surprising. In December, they passed another $900 billion worth of relief. And then when Biden was inaugurated after that, another $1.9 trillion, that was the American Rescue Plan. And nobody really seriously asked, how are you going to pay for it? What kind of taxes are you going to raise to pay for this spending? Are we going to cut spending somewhere else? We just did it, right? Congress appropriated and the spending just happened. Because this was seen as a crisis, right? And in crisis, we don't need to worry about how to pay for spending. And modern money theory, of course, received a lot of attention during during the pandemic. And one of the claims of people, mainstream people especially, was that MMT has found a new way to finance the spending, and that's a central bank helicopter money, or MMT is basically print and spend. But of course, we can only do this in a crisis because this is dangerous, it's inflationary. We will end up like the Weimar Republic or Zimbabwe. You take your pick. But of course, MMT was never really about helicopter money, and MMT was not print and spend. What MMT says is that crisis or not, there is really just one way for governments to spend. And this is, basically the central bank credits the reserves of the banks, and the banks credit the accounts of the spending recipients. And if you think about the stimulus checks, this is exactly how it happened. In most cases, they weren't really checks. You just woke up one day and there was more money in your account than there was the day before. And so the Fed credited the account of your bank at the Fed, and then your bank credited your account at the bank, and that's how the stimulus payments happened. So when MMT says that the central bank, that this is how the government spends by crediting bank accounts, this is not a prescription. We're not trying to say, let's, change the way things work. Let's spend by printing money. And of course, there is no printing involved at all. This is just a description of how it happens. So this was the crisis response. And once we were supposedly over the crisis and into the territory of Build Back Better plans, two of them, the pay for logic was back. And so Biden proposed two plans, the American Jobs Plan, the goal of which was to try to do something about climate change. And there was the initial proposal was $2.3 trillion over 8 years. And then there was the American Families Plan, which was trying to catch up to the United States to other developed nations by providing universal pre-K, by providing some benefits to parents so that the children would not be in poverty, to reduce childhood poverty, such as the child tax credits, basically prolonging them for another 10 years. Universal free college, at least community college, social infrastructure, right? That's what it was called. And the pay for logic was back. And the Democrats and the administration was the one that basically tried to bring it back. Biden and the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen insisted on pay-fors, and we were going to pay for this spending, which was going to occur over 8 or 10 years, but we were going to spend for it over 15 years, and we were going to raise an alphabet soup of taxes to do that. A corporate profits tax, taxes on high profit corporations, a surcharge basically, taxes on high earners, on high wealth, and a hike of a capital gains tax. And Yellen insisted that we need to do that. And this is a quote from her, a TV interview she did, where she said, we do need fiscal space to be able to address emergencies like the one that we've been in with respect to the pandemic. We don't want to use up all of that fiscal space, and over the long run, deficits need to be contained to keep our federal finances on a sustainable basis. So I believe that we should pay for this historic investments. So the pay for logic was back, the same fiscal policy space that somehow needed to be saved so that we could respond to the next crisis. This logic was back. And this is exactly the same logic that was used during the global financial or after the global financial crisis. We couldn't do more. The stimulus couldn't be bigger because we had to save this magic fiscal policy space so that we could use it in the future. And of course, when Congress was appropriating trillions of dollars of spending, right? It just did that without any care for what we had done in the past, because we didn't have to worry about what we had or had not done in the past. We needed the spending, and the spending just happened with congressional appropriation. So modern money theory insists that there is no such thing as fiscal space in financial terms. The sovereign government cannot save in financial terms because the money is the government's IOU. So you cannot really save your own IOUs. It just does not make any sense. And fiscal space only makes sense in real terms. There is a limited amount of real resources that can be used, and depending on how much the private sector is using, the government can only use the rest without causing any price pressures. And I'll speak to that a bit more later. Federal government spending is not paid for when taxes are imposed or collected. It's paid for when the Treasury cuts a check, or more appropriately, when accounts are credited. That's it. Spending is paid for when accounts are credited. And we don't even know the budgetary outcome when the spending happens, right? So we can't say that this particular spending is going to be deficit spending because the budgetary outcome is only known ex post. It depends on economic performance. It depends on what the other sectors of the economy are going to do because of the sectoral balance identity, the balances of the three sectors: the government, the domestic private sector, and the foreign sector have to sum up to zero. So the government deficit depends on what the other sectors are doing, what they're trying to do to their balances. So The MMT concludes that the federal government can make any and all payments as they come due. We don't need to save for it. We don't need to save for the rainy day. And regardless of where that spending takes us financially in terms of the deficit levels or the debt levels, all of that is sustainable for a sovereign government, regardless of the numbers. And of course, you just have to look at Japan with their deficit and debt numbers to see that the sky is not going to fall. From the MMT perspective, taxes really cannot pay for spending. And I guess I should stop saying the MMT perspective, because I think the MMT perspective is the reality. So taxes cannot pay for spending because taxes can only be paid with bank reserves, and bank reserves only come from treasury spending, central bank purchases, or lending. So these are the only sources of reserves. And so if taxes are paid with reserves, by debiting reserves, then taxes cannot be paid unless reserves have already been put in the system through treasury spending, central bank purchases, or lending. You cannot take out what you have not already put in. So we need to spend before we can collect taxes. Now, what are taxes really for? Sometimes people would say, well, if taxes don't pay for spending, then we don't really need taxes. But of course, we do need taxes, and they do perform important functions in the economy. So I'm not going to talk about the taxes drive money side of things. I'm going to talk about the other functions that taxes perform. And we've known since the 1940s, at least, that taxes are obsolete as a source of revenue. And I say 1940s because Bursley Rummel, who was a New Dealer, chairman of the New York Fed, and the father of income tax withholding, he wrote a paper in 1946, which was titled "Taxes for Revenue are Obsolete." He basically says that the war, World War II, taught us that the function of taxes is not to raise revenue. Rather, it's to remove private demand to free resources for government programs. That's one of the functions of taxes. And of course, during World War II, we really needed that function of taxes because the government sector grew immensely because of the war effort, because of the war spending, and we had to do something to prevent inflation because there was limited amount for civilian consumption, and taxes was one of the tools. I'm not saying that was the only tool, but taxation was one of the tools that the government used to remove private demand, to create room in the economy for more public spending. And of course, that's always been the MMT approach, that taxes create room in the economy for public spending to allow the government to pursue the public purpose. Taxes, of course, can also be used to reduce inequality of income and wealth, and that's also a very important function of taxes, although that's not the only way to reduce income inequality. They can distribute costs to beneficiaries of government programs, and they can also punish bad behavior or encourage good behavior. Now, when we look at taxes as a source of revenue, however, we don't necessarily, and we don't impose taxes in view of their functions. We're going to make mistakes, right? We're going to impose the wrong kind of taxes, and we're going to not impose them sufficiently, right? They're going to be too low or potentially too high. So if we want to shift resources from private to public use, then taxes have to be designed to reduce private spending, and not every tax is going to cut it. So if we want to tax millionaires and billionaires, that's very good. We should do it because that can help us tackle income inequality, but that's not necessarily going to reduce spending very much. I mean, one of the proposals of the Biden administration was to increase the marginal income tax rate from 37 to 39.6%, something like that. We were basically taking it back to where it was before the Trump tax cuts. And of course, inequality was still a problem before the Trump tax cuts, right? So that was not going to solve our inequality problem. So raising it from 37 to 39.6, right? Nobody thinks that's going to solve our inequality problem. But the reason why it wasn't raised higher, or at least one of the reasons, was that it wasn't raised higher to say 50% or even 70%, right? Because we were just trying to raise enough revenue to pay for the spending that we wanted to do, right? And this tells you that if you approach taxes from the perspective of revenue raising rather than from functional perspective, you're not going to come up with the right taxation policy. Now, broad-based but progressive taxes, on the other hand, on income or consumption, they can be effective in reducing resource usage. And they may not necessarily be popular or, fair, but, if the goal is to reduce resource use, then that's what you need to go for. So the pay-fors that simply match spending and tax revenue, they're not useful for reducing private spending, reducing the usage of resources. They do not necessarily create the fiscal space that you need if you're trying to engage in major, say, infrastructure spending or other kind of major public spending. To control inflation, you need to match tax take to desired reduction of private spending. And there is no reason to expect that if you're matching taxation and spending dollar for dollar, you're going to achieve that, right? How much do you need to tax millionaires and billionaires to reduce their spending by $1? That's really the question that you need to ask. The plan, as I already mentioned, was also paying for the 8 years of spending with 15 years of taxes. So we would basically continue withdrawing demand from the economy for an additional 7 years through taxes after the government stops spending. Where is the sense in that, right? It makes no sense to continue withdrawing demand, which puts a deflationary pressure on the economy after the government spending has stopped. And as I already noted, the tax plan fails to target inequality. There's no reason why a balanced budget approach to taxes and spending coincides with our desired inequality reduction. The example that I brought up with a marginal tax rate increase actually shows you that it doesn't. So this pay-for approach to government spending and taxation shortchanges us on both sides of the budget, the spending side and the taxation side. We don't tax enough, and we don't spend enough. Even if the Build Back Better plans had passed fully, that would not have been sufficient to tackle climate change, right? What we need is something like 5% of GDP. That's how much we need to spend per year for 10 years to green our economy within 10 years. And what we were planning to do was something like 1% of GDP. That's how much we were planning to spend with the original plans. And of course, even that did not materialize.
Time's pretty much almost, if you could wrap it up.
I'm on my last slide.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
All right. So the spend and tax, we need to spend and tax with a view of accomplishing our goals, whether that's fighting climate change or fighting income inequality. The pay-for approach does not work. If we do need to save resources, and that's not necessarily clear that we need it to, because as I said, the climate change plan was only 1% of GDP. If you added the other one, the families plan, together they would be a little over 2% of GDP per year for 10 years. So that's not, it's not certain that we could not have accommodated that kind of demand without needing to resort to taxation to reduce resource use, at least not a sort of a broad-based taxation, right? We could need to make room for certain resources, but not necessarily for others. So, but if we needed to, we could do something like a deferred compensation scheme where we would tax today, but we would promise a more generous Social Security payment, or we could promise more generous other programs such as aid to families with children and so on. The high marginal tax rates on income and wealth are needed to reduce income inequality. Small changes will not do. And of course, we need additional policies to increase income and wealth at the bottom. Taxation is not the only approach. And so this is where MMT's job guarantee with generous wages and benefits comes into the picture as well. All right, I'll stop right here.
Thank you. Next, we have Robert and Steve. Go ahead and start whenever you're ready.
Okay. Robert, you want to put the PowerPoint up? Okay, good. Thank you all for attending. Thanks to the Association for Evolutionary Economics for allowing Robert and me to present. I'm going to do an introduction and talk about the child tax credit, and Robert's going to present the data. And if we have a little bit of time left at the end, I'll talk about the policy implications for a minute or two. But I want to start not with the child tax credit, but I want to start with child allowances. And for those of you who aren't aware of child allowances, they're monthly payments that are made to families with children, and they're made for a specific reason. Even if you don't have children, you're probably aware that the income needs of a family with children are going to be much more than the income needs of a family without children. And the question is how to go about taking care of that. Historically, it was actually a private firm in France in the 1870s that developed the first child allowance program, and they paid their workers more who had children and based their workers more based on the number of children that they had. Unfortunately, this led to problems. The firm was not competitive, went out of business soon, and so that didn't work. A second approach to the problem was an industry-wide solution where one industry would collect money from all of the firms and would then pay out child allowances to firms based on what they would pay to their employees for the number of children that allowances were going to be paid for. This solution also didn't work very well, and it led to, again, competitive problems. Industries that set up a solution wound up being less competitive than industries without making these payments. And so that policy was scrapped. And it was finally recognized that if this policy was going to succeed, it had to be a national policy. And Belgium in 1930 was the first country that instituted a national-wide policy of child allowances. France, which was a pioneer in child allowances, followed shortly thereafter, 1932. The UK, under the influence of Keynes and Beveridge, developed a child allowance policy in the 1940s, and one after another countries followed relatively quickly, setting up their own child allowance programs. In 1972, when Japan set up its child allowance policy, the United States became the only developed nation without a child allowance policy. Instead, the United States came up with another solution for dealing with this problem of what do you do about families that have lots of children and their additional income needs. Instead of child allowances, the United States relied on tax exemptions for children starting in 1945, when each family was allowed to deduct from its taxable income $500 for each dependent child. And these policies of child allowances, along with of tax exemptions for children, along with other tax exemptions for individuals, ended in the year 2018. But the real problem with the tax exemptions is that they don't help poor families. They don't help the families in need of the extra income. And that's the case for two reasons. Reason number one is that low-income poor families are generally in very low tax brackets, which means they get back a much lower percent of the value of the exemption than families in higher tax brackets. And the second problem is that the exemptions were not refundable. In other words, if you didn't owe any money in taxes, you got back nothing. If you owed only a few dollars in taxes, that's all you could get back as a result of the exemption. And so another approach really was needed for children in families or for families with children and low incomes. And that solution was the child tax credit. And the child tax credit was first proposed by a commission called the National Commission on Children in 1981. And the commission actually did propose a national tax credit or something akin to a child allowance. And in 1998, the United States instituted a $400 per child tax credit. The credit was non-refundable. Since 1998, the credit was made partially refundable in 2002, and the credit was also increased in value from $400 per child to $1,000 per child. Then in 2017, the value of the credit was increased to $2,000 for each child under the age of 17, also with the stipulation that the child had to be a US citizen. The big change came in 2019 when a couple of senators and then a couple of members of the House of Representatives introduced a bill that would both increase the value of the child credit from $2,000 to $3,000 and then added another $6,000 per year for children under the age of 6. And then importantly, also made the tax credit fully refundable. And now the important thing, the American Rescue Plan of 2021 adopted all of these changes, and then one very important addition, which is that from July to December of 2021, the child tax credit was paid to households on a monthly basis rather than awaiting the end of the year, having households put in their tax returns and then getting a refund from the government. And effectively for 6 months at the end of last year, the United States actually had a child allowance program. And now Robert will take over and talk about some of the economic consequences of this.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and thanks everyone for being here. The paper currently has 14 tables in it, so I will try to bore you as little as humanly possible for an economist anyway. So what Steve and I did was we took the Survey of Consumer Finance's most recent one, which is 2019, and we sort of did an experiment where we said, what if we applied these new metrics to families back in 2019, sort of, pre-pandemic, and the latest data we had available, and how would that adjust child poverty? Now, most of you know who were here, Tim, I'm glad he's chairing this session. Tim Wunder had published a paper a few years ago and presented it at the AFI Association on Child Poverty, which was really good. He did something a little bit different where he sort of gave a little more generous, allowance to children, where Steve and I kind of said, okay, what if we just took what was passed and applied it to 2019, what would happen? But anybody who's interested in this can also see Tim's paper from a few years ago in the JEI. So as we apply this, we sort of looked at, okay, single people, married people, both. Obviously, the most important one, if you don't have kids, there's no effect. Having children, kids are the largest poverty group that exists in the United States. And so, this obviously matters because we're talking about a lot of people. About 11 million kids in the US live in poverty. It has long-term implications on their lives. And so, there's lots of socioeconomic effects. What we can see here is if we look at both, the important piece is that, for both groups, married and single, it reduces household poverty. In other words, households that have children that are classified as poor using traditional measures of the traditional thresholds or the thresholds that are used currently for poverty. So, if you have 3 kids, you need more income, right? So we made all those adjustments using current measures. So right now we sort of said combining everybody, 11% would have been poor in the Survey of Consumer Finance 2019. But if we allotted those families the child credits, the refundable credits, that this would actually have reduced poverty by about 46.2%. In fact, it would. We're obviously using the weighted data for the Survey of Consumer Finances. This encompasses about 6,000 US households. So it's far from comprehensive, but it gives us a good idea. So we did the same thing, only we did it per child. So instead of looking at households that are poor, we looked at the number of children who are poor. Again, same thing, not a big difference here from the earlier one, but we do see a pretty significant, 43 and some change percent reduction in poverty, just simply counting up the number of kids who are poor. Because obviously a poor household with 4 kids versus a poor household with 1 kid, right? They counted 1 for 1 in the previous table. But in this one, if you have a family of, if you have 4 kids in a family that are poor, that counts as 4, whereas, 1 is just 1. But nonetheless, we see a similar reduction. Then we measured poverty. We measured poverty several different ways. We only picked 2 of them. One was the traditional way poverty, or the common way poverty is measured today in the US. Then we did a relative poverty measure, where we did an equivalence scale of income, where we took income divided by the square root of household size. And then we took the median and then 50% of that median. So it's a pretty common way to get at relative poverty. What that does is that increases the number of people who are poor. It about doubles it, roughly. So it about doubles the size number of poor. And again, we see particularly this last column here, the both column, right? Poverty was 23.5%, brought it down almost 50%, down to 11.9%. Now, what this means is, here, I'll just move to children and I'll sort of give you the punchline for this part of it. So again, measuring relative poverty per child, each kid, reduced it by about 38%, a little bit over 38%. And what this means, if we translate this into, again, 11 million poor children in the United States, it would reduce, this tax refund, that was attributed, the 3,000 and 3,600 would reduce child poverty by around 5 million kids. It would pull 5 million children out of poverty. So, we're talking about significant numbers. I don't think it surprises people. You give more, more people at the low end of the income scale, right? More money, it's obviously going to raise more people out of poverty. But even what many of us would consider a pretty modest increase has a pretty dramatic effect on poverty. So obviously something like what Tim had proposed in his paper from a few years ago, a little more generous, has an even bigger impact on this. And so anyway, so we also did a couple other things. We looked at inequality as another measure. So we did a few different measurements. We used the traditional Gini coefficient, and we see that it brought the Gini coefficient down 3%. For inequality. Then we did some decile ratios. We did 90-10, 90-50, 50-10. Again, not surprising, we see the biggest drop in 90-10, because people in the 90% basically aren't getting anything. But people at the 10% are all getting, pretty sizable increase, those with children anyway, are getting a pretty sizable increase in their income, available income. And so we see that reduced inequality in that decile ratio 90-10 by, a little over 9%. And then we did something a little different, sort of a new technique called the Palmer ratio. And that takes the top 10% of all income that's given to the top 10%, and then all the income as a share of the bottom 40%, and just takes a ratio of those two to show the difference. And so again, we just see some significant reductions. Last table here is Steve and I've done a lot of work on the debt poor, which is how much debt people have and how that takes away from disposable income. And you can see that, again, adding this extra child refundable credit has a pretty sizable, reduction in the number of people who we classify as being debt poor. In other words, people who have sizable amounts of debt, paying off just the interest on that debt reduces their available income. And so we subtract that away from their income, and then we add to that the child tax credit.
1 minute left.
Great.
Perfect. Let me sort of conclude by both talking about the efficiency of the child tax credit. The estimates are that this would cost a little over $100 billion a year to continue. On the other hand, the estimates are that the gains from it to the country would be somewhere between 200 and 300 billion a year. The estimates depend on both increased tax revenues over time and also reduced spending on various government programs, because children who grow up in poverty are likely to earn less when they're an adult. The other gain is going to be from this, depending on how much poverty is actually reduced. And we know of only one other study that's been done similar to ours, which was the Jane Family Institute. They came up with 40, it was 40 plus a fraction as the decline in child poverty, which was close to ours. It was a little bit over 40%. But I think it's worth comparing this to estimates that the Columbia University Center on Poverty and Social Policy made at the end of last year, when they were actually looking at what was the reduction in poverty to families as a result of having gotten the refundable child tax credit. And the numbers here are 1/3 less than what we assumed. And so this is a big difference between what theoretically you're going to get if everybody winds up getting the child tax credit that they're eligible for, and what actually happens. And I think the conclusion is that lots of people are not getting the child tax credit, or they didn't get it at the end of last year. This is a problem that certainly requires further research, and on that I will stop.
Thank you so much. And last but definitely not least, Greg Hayden. Greg, you are still muted. Greg, you are muted. I can't unmute him. Bottom left, there's a mute button. Greg?
If anybody can read lips, please jump in.
What is his last name? I'll try to send him a
Hayden?
message.
Hayden.
How's that?
Okay.
That's good. There we go.
All right,
Now
sorry.
share your screen and we're good.
All right, let's start again. This paper explains the need to integrate the concepts of A, zero greenhouse gas emissions, B, the precautionary principle, and C, environmental impact statements to improve climate change mitigation. Figure 1 is used to bring together projections of the consequences of 3 different coexisting categories of technologies and their contribution to the 2 degrees Celsius goal. Figure 1 shows the results of carbon dioxide emission technologies and the reductions of emissions from conventional mitigation technologies, along with CO2 removal technologies. Even with foreseeable technologies, that goal will be difficult and expensive to achieve according to assessment models that link greenhouse gas emissions, the economy, and climate. Therefore, it is important for policy agencies to base policy actions on refined studies of all aspects of Figure 1. The vertical axis is the CO2e emissions per year. The letter E after CO2 indicates that all greenhouse gases have been converted to being an equivalent to carbon dioxide and aggregated. The net level of emissions to keep the level of increase in global warming below 2 degrees is represented by the black trend line in Figure 1 designated as below 2 degrees Celsius. The baseline reference is the border line at the top of Figure 1. It represents the business as usual scenario. That level of emissions, if maintained according to the United Nations, would cross thresholds causing catastrophic climate change damage. The area with the pattern of lateral dashed lines at the top of Figure 1 represents mitigated greenhouse gas emissions from conventional abatement technologies. These options include, among others, a reduction in overall energy use, a shift away from fossil fuels, and technical change to increase the efficiency of production. In Figure 1, the area representing non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, such as methane, nitrogen oxide, and the F gases from emitting technologies, is indicated by the pattern of randomly scattered dots. These technologies are emitting and continuing to emit non-greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. The area representing CO2 greenhouse gas emissions from emitting technologies is indicated in Figure 1 by the pattern of plus signs. These technologies are emitting and continuing to emit CO2 into the atmosphere. The area representing carbon removal technologies, as indicated in Figure 1, by the demand-shaped tessellation, represents removal of CO2 from the atmosphere by technologies such as afforestation and carbon capture technologies that remove CO2 from the atmosphere and store it. An important conclusion from Figure 1 is that conventional abatement technologies are not sufficient to bring greenhouse gas to the level consistent with achieving 2 degrees because of the continuing emissions. Thus, carbon removal technologies are required to capture and store CO2 in order to reach the point labeled net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the end of this century, and net negative greenhouse gas emissions after that point. As indicated in Figure 1, gross negative CO2 emissions do not begin in earnest until after 2030, and they continue to grow until they're equal to CO2 plus other greenhouse gases about 2090, which makes it possible to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions after 2090, and it's indicated in Figure 1. The vertical distance below the horizontal axis of the gross negative CO2 emissions from carbon removal is greater than the vertical distance of CO2e emissions above the horizontal axis. So there are, as labeled, net negative greenhouse gas emissions. This area is indicated by the pattern of diagonal stripes. If the vertical distance below the axis can continue to grow, progress can be made toward first the goal of continuing the below 2 degree trend, and second, the possible movement to the goal of holding the global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Up to the point of net zero greenhouse gas emissions, the total greenhouse gas in the atmosphere continued to increase, although the new greenhouse added each year continued to decrease. Thus, after the net zero greenhouse gas point, the great accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere will still be there with all its damaging consequences, however, with the possibility of its decrease. Figure 1 indicates the kind of research and mitigation policy that is ongoing and outlines the kinds of concerns government bodies need to deal with for successful greenhouse gas emission.
I was sharing the screen so people could see the picture.
Figure 1 is used to bring together projections of the consequences of 3 different coexisting categories of technologies and their contribution to the 2-degree goal. Figure 1, I've already said that. Let me go on down here. Here we go, I think. Any consideration of greenhouse gas emissions quickly clarifies that scientific projections are uncertain. Thus, it is not possible to decisively to anticipate threats from action taken today. Yet analysts may foresee the possibility of harm in the future without being able to prove it with certainty. Because it would not make sense to ignore such foresight, the precautionary principle was developed. Where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. Thus, the precautionary principle offers a strong presumption in favor of a high level of protection and a justification for treating certain functions or qualities as inviolable. Therefore, agencies should take action to avoid potentially damaging impacts of substances that are persistent, toxic, and liable to bioaccumulate, even where there is no scientific evidence to prove a causal link between emissions and effects. Considerable economic analysis in response to climate change science exposes misleading findings because the precautionary principle is ignored in the climate change analysis practiced by mainstream economists. Their main problem is that they refuse to build their analysis to A, take the findings of climate scientists seriously, B, recognize the devastating and unpredictable damage of climate change, and C, conduct analysis that makes goals such as the 2-degree goal as the goal to be achieved. This has especially been the case with the analysis of William Nordhaus. Nordhaus, along with others, bakes in a given future with cost-benefit analysis that places monetary growth of GDP as the primary goal, with no precaution with respect to all of GDP's harmful products, rather than conducting an analysis that places the achievement of greenhouse gas and climate goals as the primary goals. For all the reasons the cost-benefit analysis has been rejected in general, and for the special problems it encounters because of precautionary principle concerns, it needs to be rejected for climate change analysis. Analysts need to recognize what is most valuable. What is of the greatest value is the protection of the globe from global warming and climate change, not the maximization of bads and disservices that make up much of GDP, as Nordhaus does. To make the emissions gap information exhibited in Figure 1 and the proposed mitigation policy emanating from the precautionary principle yield meaningful results that is necessary to make judgments and decisions about greenhouse gas emissions of specific projects. Traditionally, the means for governmental units to make judgments and decisions about the environmental impact of particular projects on the environment is the environmental impact statement. The EIS is part of an environmental impact process. The process of the EIA is to ensure that appropriate attention is given to environmental issues. It is to provide adequate information on projects that affect the environment. Unfortunately, to date, EISs have in many cases failed to protect the environment. Most importantly for our concern here, greenhouse gas emissions have not played a role in EISs in the United States. The concern about emissions gaps and utilization of the precautionary principle will not lead to successful mitigation policy for protecting against climate change without an EIS that includes greenhouse gas emissions, atmospheric impacts, and enforcement for all projects. For effective enforcement, legislation regarding EISs need major reform, and agency infrastructure needs to be expanded. In conclusion, the paths of the three technologies, more correctly, socio-technologies, indicated in Figure 1 are going to be difficult to discern as well as difficult to control. If we do not mobilize to appropriately and adequately discern and guide, the war will be lost. The trend line across the top of Figure 1 labeled business as usual is the William Nordhaus approach to win the war by allowing economic agents to make their own decisions in response to markets. That, according to him, should lead to about a 4 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, which climate scientists have warned would be catastrophic. Given the complicated reality, the use of the precautionary principle becomes imperative, as does the use of EISs for decision-making and enforcement of mitigation plans. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Instead of pontificating on what I think, do we have any questions from the audience? And if you don't want to, you can put it in the chat or just raise your hand. There's a hand button on the bottom.
Tim, you've disabled the chat. We can't use it.
I have not, as far as I know. Did that go out? Everyone see hello in the chat? On the bottom, there's a chat button.
Yes, only the hosts and co-hosts can use the chat. It's
Ah.
disabled. So maybe Erica, if you're listening, can you help us disable the chat?
Or enable the chat.
Yep, 1 second.
Enable the chat. Thank you.
Okay, well, then I will just ask a 1-minute response from all of you. We've got several papers here and we're talking about changes. I know some of the papers are definitely, we should do this. But for those of you who don't have, we should do this, how do you accomplish what you're looking for? How do you get people to actually do it? So we'll go straight down the line. Asimina, how would you go about doing it? And then go straight down the lines of comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. Well, my paper was a bit more theoretical, so probably I should give a more practical example. I thought of talking about my experience being on the board of a worker integration co-op that targeted individuals with mental health problems or users of mental health services. So there you would see a social enterprise involved in various businesses like catering. attempting to combine various economic and social values, apart from making a surplus, which was actually distributed amongst the workers and non-workers, the members of the co-op. There were targets on overcoming mental health problems, overcoming social stigma, overcoming conventional labor market practices. So there were more flexible hours adjusted to workers' personal needs, which can be of interest to the rest of the labor market if we consider that we work for 15 and 20 hours. And eventually we will develop mental health problems under these kinds of conditions.
I would suggest
So
one other thing you might
Yes.
want to look at is the unschooling movement. And Sudbury is an interesting thing that's very syndicalist. So those are really cool ideas. Who's next on the one? I think it was Eric. I'm just trying to make sure everyone gets a chance. I'm sorry.
yes, yes, of course. Thank you very much.
How would you get the lettuce effect? I mean, or the lettuce roll? How would you start it?
Right, that's a good question. Basically, I've already, come up with a number of just very practical suggestions. The basic idea is that we need to look at capacity in terms of real goods. There's a very interesting consistency between neoclassical economics, money is a veil, and F. Foster's quote, whatever is technically possible, feasible is financially possible. And we need to start looking at real goods and services and kind of cast aside these kind of monetary and real GDP proxies. And what you discover when you start doing that, for example, the mitigation costs that Yeva spoke about aren't really financial costs at all. They come down largely to labor. There's a huge immigration crisis. We could simply allow a lot of immigration into high carbon producing countries and have them provide the labor that's necessary to do all of the green transformation that we're talking about. That's one idea. I'll just list maybe two more quickly. Another idea is the book is we really need to implement Drawdown by Paul Hawken. It's not a perfect plan, but it needs to be the forerunner. It needs to really be how a Green New Deal operates, is using Drawdown. That is technical efficiency. That's institutional economics, really. He has calculated, scientifically, basically 85 solutions that will draw down global climate change. And a good example of the inefficiency of not using it is the building retrofitting is a very popular scheme to reduce global climate change, but he has that as number 85. I mean, there's 84 better solutions that we could be using. And consistent with his 2018 book, I'll just say very quickly, he finds that educating women and introducing family planning globally has dramatic effects on reducing global climate change. So we need to start tying aid to economies doing that. Iran had a very successful birth reduction program, and once the fertility reduction goes into effect, like in Iran, it turned out that even when they tried to reverse it, when the government wanted to have more population and nuclear war, people didn't want to have kids anymore. It's like green eggs and ham. This is what I'm talking about: perceived versus real utility. Once people start, engaging in these more earth-friendly systems, they actually find that they're a lot happier. So we need to kind of push past this, these ceremonial institutions that aren't doing anybody any good.
Sounds good. Yeva, I mean, MMT and Levi works really well. Comments?
I'll just yield my time. I think I basically contrasted what we did and what we should have done. So I think I'm good.
Robert, Steve, if you'd like, there's a question in chat for y'all. Anyone else has chat? That's how we're going to go.
I saw Deb's question, and that's what I was going to talk about. So let me just say a few words. The problem is essentially, if people file tax returns, it's easy to get them back the money. Lots of poor households don't file tax returns. And then the question is, how do you get the money? The solution that the IRS came up with is you can go onto their website, and then from their website you can apply, and that obviously hasn't worked. All right, that seems to be a large part of the problem of people not getting the money that they should have gotten. In addition, the website wasn't available in any other language other than English, another big problem. Actually, in terms of the solution, or one possible solution. I'm doing a paper with one of my former Colorado State University graduate students, and we're going to present it at the ICAPE conference immediately following the ASSAs. And she's interested in public banks as a solution to the problem. And so we are writing about that, and I'm hoping that paper will be out relatively shortly after the conference.
Greg, your paper, you talk about, moving more towards instilling carbon greenhouse and cost benefit analysis kind of thing. How would you get that done in the place where we're at now politically? Where would you start?
Well, what I'm going to recommend is not what I think ought to be done, but it's the world we're in. We have decided in the United States that we will have each city or each county undertake the policies to get rid of or to cut down on greenhouse gases. That would have been like going into World War II and telling Columbus, Ohio, well, you raise an infantry and you send it where you want to, and then you go town by town. But that's where we are. We're saying, New York City, you have your policies and so on. Therefore, I think given that world, what I recommend is for all of us to get very involved at the local level, the city council and so on. And that's my next step in terms of research, of putting together research for the local community. Now, what these cities and counties are doing is just coming up with bull. I mean, we're going to cut it this much, and then they just kind of walk away with it, from it. Now, that's not so true for New York City. They're actually doing things. All right, so that's with regard to moving to cut down on the amount of greenhouse gas. With regard to the precautionary principle, this is much more common at the policy level in Europe than it is here. And I think the best that I've seen, I mean, you go through all of this, all these studies and so on, the best I've seen is Germany, where they have, and you know what they're going to do in Germany, they're going to have everyone sit down together. So that the corporate people, the union people, the government people, the nonprofits, and so on, sat down together with regard to a project and say, well, this is this, and they fight it out and so on. That I think is what I recommend. And with regard to the EISs, the environmental impact statements, I've been involved with those in the past. And once I wrote a 300-page critique of one of them for the open hearings, and we got a project stopped. More of that has to be done. People need to get involved early with regard to those and stay with the projects and keep doing the research, knock down the cost benefit analysis, because they'll always get some charlatan consultant to come in and do a cost benefit analysis that says, oh, this is a wonderful project. So getting involved there, and there's a great history of good research to draw on there.
I'm going to direct this question to Yeva and Randy, and all of you, actually. We're living in the United States, I don't know about around the world, but in the United States, we're living in a system where I think there's one political party who's just completely gone beyond any kind of genuine arguments. They just are lying straight up. And the conservative movement in general. We sort of assume that political stuff might happen in a reasonable manner, and we offer policies and we offer descriptions to get these things done. So, for example, the child tax credit. When the guy from West Virginia said, "Well, the people will use it to do drugs and go fishing." How do we deal in the real world with what is clearly, in so many cases, psychopathic and sociopathic people who have very large things. And I don't even know if there's an answer for this, but like with MMT, we've been talking for a long time. We can do it if we have the will. And yet that's not even people who are of good faith won't accept that, much less the people who are now on the far right who really are, they don't care about hurting people. So is there any hope, I guess, from your perspectives? Because we have a very broad range of discussions going on here.
I could say, I don't know if you invited Wray or speak, so I don't know if I have something to say about that, if I'm invited to.
I would like Yeva to go first if she has something she hasn't had a chance yet. Please.
Sure. So, well, I think we could point out that we already did it, right? 5 trillion that was spent and the sky didn't fall, right? And we spent it all in a matter of a year and a half. And what we're talking about here is much less than that, spent over 8 years, over 10 years, right? So, you know, just pointing that out, I think is important, right? And as an economist and as an MMT economist, I think the best I can do is just study this and point this out and just keep working. And I mean, I'm not optimistic right now, but I'm as optimistic right now as I've ever been. I think the right is able to imagine and big, right? And the left has always been like, oh, we can't do this, we can't do that. What about politics? What about this and that? But I think we do need to imagine big, and the things that happened just, you know, because of during the pandemic, I don't think any of us could imagine that they would be happening, right? Trillions of dollars of relief provided by the US government. So yeah, I guess imagine big and keep working, and not an expert on politics, so I cannot really talk about that. Maybe Randy wants to chime in there.
I'll just add one thing. Yeah, I mean, since the election, things are very, very scary. And the Democrats are very likely to lose in the next election. But I would say that this is largely the Democrats' fault. Some of you probably have seen Yarmouth, the Democratic, on the Democratic side, the head of the Budget Committee in the House. He's got it absolutely, completely. And when Yeva says she's more optimistic than in the past, I mean, this is the reason to be optimistic. There is no doubt at all that the Democratic side of the Budget Committee completely understands this, completely. And instead, Biden chose pay-fors. This was the Democratic choice, pay-fors, knowing that the opposition to taxes was going to be huge. They could not win. They could not win. They can't even win over the Democrats, okay? They didn't need Republicans to get the Biden plan through. They could have done it. They chose not to do it. So, you know, I would pin this on the Democrats, not the Republicans, although the Republicans are extremely scary.
Asimina, if you could, I cut you off. I would like to hear your comments on this too.
Well, coming from a country that, well, you can't say that it is a country that in the global scene has much of a hegemonic role. So they just have to accept everything that's coming from the outside, mostly neoliberal trends and policies and so on and so forth. But going back into history, thinking about the German occupation or the world wars and the civil wars and the dictatorships, the lesson I have been taught is that if you want to get something done, you have to break down walls and get your hands dirty. Otherwise, you're just letting everybody else get the best of you. But I don't know, sometimes I'm not that optimistic because even people that have these ideas in theory are not willing to get their hands dirty or break down walls or move from the comfort of their chair. So I don't know, maybe the next generations that have been through the financial crises, that have been through the health crises, might see it in a different way, as long as we tell them that they have an option, that they can have a better life than the one that we are giving them. That's the only thing I can think of at the moment. Thank you.
Eric, you said you wanted to comment on stuff, please. You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I think that I agree that the left has been largely responsible for this. I think Noam Chomsky made the comment that the reason the Republican Party became so successful is that they began to adopt sort of a social agenda that was very friendly to the southern states, i.e. in opposing abortion and so forth. And that's really, even though the Republicans had no inherent interest in that, that's really what has endeared them to the South. And in a general way, the red states, I mean, I was not born in red states, but I've lived in them for about 6 or 7 years now. And basically, I feel that fundamentally the left is excluding them, and they're just throwing gasoline onto a fire by doing that. They just feel like they're demonized constantly. There's a sort of inherent prejudice against them. I mean, white students, I've seen it happen as a substitute teacher, can be very hurt, by racism against them from Blacks. And it's like they sort of have no rights in the sort of empowered coastal sphere of European Union America. And it just makes them more and more angry and more crazy. And I think we need to follow Martin Luther King and be generally, all inclusive of all people and ideas, and not be so militant in our sort of self-righteousness about our social agenda and say, hey, everybody has a voice and we need to listen and include them and stop excluding them, and pushing them against the wall. I think that.
And I guess I'll leave it to Steve and Robert to finish off. I mean, clearly, I think with the child stipend, this should have been a universally popular position, and it's been killed. I mean, how can something that how I don't even know. I don't even know what I'm asking anymore. When that happened, I was so pissed. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, going back to connecting that to your original question about, why these things happen. Steve and I have been struggling with this for a while now, sort of, our premise is that, evidence matters. I mean, you talk about them, using drugs. Well, Purdue Pharma, clearly, made a few bucks off of that. But, the reality is, from the work we've done, most of these people are using this money for, food, home repairs, rent. I mean, all this stuff. So for us, evidence is key. What are they spending the money on? Well, one of our big pieces, they're using it to spend down on debt that they had accumulated from their car breaking down or buying public transportation or doing other things. And so that's something we've been developing for years, to be honest with you, as to putting together a narrative. And there have been some interesting studies on this. Financial Diaries was published a few years ago, and some other pieces that speak to those issues. I do think the evidence matters, and I think that gives people, a better story than, the welfare queen type story coming from, other political agendas.
The other thing that's important, of course, is the politics. And at this point, the Republicans are going to get together and vote against anything that's going to improve the economy and improve the lives of people, because then they can run for re-election and blame it all on the Democrats. And so the solution is politics matters, elections matter, and you need to get out and fight.
I saw things in the chat. We've got about 2 minutes left. Is there anything that's been really missed? Hopefully I haven't been too pushy, but with 6 people in here, 6 presentations, I figured either I was pushy or nothing would get done. So I want to apologize if I stepped on anyone's toes. It's not really my style. I hate it, but
no, you did a good job with this. Good model for a chair.
I need to get a whip next time. Thank you all. Your papers are great. If you would want any kind of comments, I've got the papers I read were really incredible, and hopefully we'll see you all. When's the next session? It's this afternoon, isn't it? By the way, Randall Wray's the Development Commons Award. He'll be talking tomorrow, so don't forget to go to that. When's the next session? Anyone know? Where's Eric Hake when we need him? He knows everything.
The annual
Membership meeting.
When is that?
now,
Membership.
right now.
Oh, right now.
Follows.
Okay.
Follows, yeah.
So everyone go there. See you guys. Thanks for being here.
Hi.
Anyone who wants to stay, we've still got the room for a little while.
Okay.